Our next guest's latest work could hardly be more timely. The writer, linguist, activist and political theorist Noam Chomsky's latest documentary, filmed over several years and which he hints might be his last, is called A Requiem for the American Dream. It paints an ugly picture of the growing gap between the richest and the poorest in the United States and details decades of policy changes that Noam Chomsky says benefit an ever smaller business and financial elite at the expense of the working and middle classes, including a huge shift in their relative tax burden. The documentary tracks changes that have turned the banking and financial industries towards speculation rather than service provision, and have massively increased these sectors as a proportion of the US economy relative to productive industries. Noam Chomsky argues that the problem with inequality on the scale that is developing in the United States is that it is corrosive to democracy, and that the history of democracy in the United States from the time of the Founding Fathers has been a cyclical battle between an elite trying to protect its position and power and sporadic uprisings of working people and the marginalised in protest. Perhaps the last major such uprising was the 1960s. Given the extraordinary US election primary race that has seen so-called outsider candidates such as Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders seriously challenging and in one case defeating establishment candidates in the running for the White House, is just such another era unfolding in the United States. Noam Chomsky, welcome. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleased to be with you.
Are we in just such a time again?
So it appears. If you take a look at the opinion, the Trump victory yesterday solidifies his position as the Republican candidate. But if you look at the attitudes towards him, the opposition, the public opposition to him is enormous, running well over 50%, just as a candidate. And Clinton is not much more popular. The hatred and anger about virtually all institutions is just overwhelming. Support for Congress has been pretty much in single digits for some years. Same elsewhere. There's tremendous anger, disillusionment, fear. If it does not take a constructive, organized form, as it did in the 1930s and to an extent in the 1960s, it could be a very threatening development.
There are several contemporary events that seem to be part of the powder keg building here. And I speak of it as a powder keg because, again, you have someone who's been a Secretary of State and has all the name profile of decades, who's been a senator, all the name profile of decades in the public eye in the form of Hillary Clinton, who would never have anticipated such a sustained challenge by Bernie Sanders, who's been around, as an activist for decades, but now is also seriously still in this race for the Democratic nomination. And is that a feature of the same kind of disillusionment with establishment politics?
It's the same kind, and in fact, if you take a close look at attitudes of Sanders and Trump supporters, they're not very different in many respects. They're taking different forms, but the actual attitudes are rather similar. In fact, basically social democratic support for support for greater government involvement in health and education, higher taxes for the rich, ending the terrible debt burden on students, opposition to the export of production and the enrichment of largely predatory financial institutions. These attitudes are quite widespread, both among Trump supporters and Sanders supporters.
And when I talked of that powder keg building, then whatever form it takes, you can identify some of the same patterns that you do in the documentary back over many decades. One of them is the clear frustration with the dysfunction of Washington politics and the fact that it's almost in gridlock, isn't it? Trying to get any decisions made in the Capitol, made in the Congress, and actually, very interestingly, when you look at the Senate and Congress opposition to what a president is trying to do, that inbuilt check was there right at the beginning. You make the point in the documentary that when the political system was being drawn up by the founding fathers, there was an appointment system to the Senate, wasn't there? It was a check built in right from the beginning.
Well, the original framework established by James Madison and others held that, I'm quoting Madison, "Power should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, the more responsible group of men, those who have a concern for property and its rights, and that a primary goal of government should be to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority." And structuring the system that way, the primary power was actually given to the Senate, which was not, as you say, not elected. The president at that time was more of an administrator. There have been many changes over the years. There's been substantial struggles which have gained far more democratic participation. There's been regressive periods. We happen to be in one now. The dysfunction you mentioned in the government is presented in a little bit of a misleading way. It's one-sided. When Obama was elected, the Republican leadership said, Mitch McConnell, others said straight out that their prime policy will be no, make sure that the country is ungovernable. And that is the source, the primary source of the so-called gridlock and dysfunction. Of course, from the point of view of the public, this looks like the system has collapsed. And to an extent it has, but it's primarily responsibility of the fact that the Republican Party shifted so far to the right that they're barely a political party anymore. This is actually recognized by some of their leading intellectuals. The leading political analyst of the American Enterprise Institute, conservative institute, Norman Ornstein, described the current Republican Party as a radical insurgency which has abandoned parliamentary politics. And that's not far from true. That's the primary source of the gridlock. But the fact of the matter is that the policies, the Democrats have also moved to the right. Today's Democrats are pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. Richard Nixon is actually the last liberal president, if you look at policies. Bernie Sanders is described as radical and extremist. But if you take a look at his policies, they wouldn't have surprised President Eisenhower. Eisenhower famously said that anyone who doesn't accept basic New Deal policies doesn't belong in the American political system. Well, Sanders is basically a New Dealer. You look at his policies, they would have been considered relatively moderate in the 1950s. All of this is a reflection of the general shift of the mainstream spectrum to the right during the neoliberal period, which began in the mid-late 70s and really began to escalate under Reagan, Thatcher in England, and others elsewhere. And it has led to somewhat similar outcomes in many different places. So in Europe, for example, the attack on democracy has been harsher than in the United States, and it's leading to the significant decline of the mainstream political parties and organizations, and a sharp rise of opposition at both right and left. That's not entirely dissimilar to the Trump-Sanders phenomenon, and due to pretty much the same kinds of policies. The neoliberal policies have had that kind of consequence almost everywhere. And in the third world, they've been really destructive. But they have led to, for a majority of the population, to near stagnation, often decline in benefits and opportunities, sense of hopelessness for the future. These are and a strong antagonism to established institutions.
I'd like to come back to that role of globalism and how much of an inevitable force it was in some ways, particularly given the technological connectedness that we have now. But could we stay, if you wouldn't mind, just stay with US politics at the moment, which is just so timely. And you talked about the Republicans. And is Ted Cruz and others now reaping the price of that policy of blocking everything that the Democratic president tried to do, including the contest he had with his own House Speaker, John Boehner, who can't abide him, over certain policies that Boehner wanted to do deals on? Is this effectively now coming back to bite the party, which does appear to be, certainly its establishment wing, in absolute meltdown?
That's quite accurate. In fact, if you look at the last few primaries elections and the primary campaigns, you could see this building up. In the last several elections, in the Republican primaries, if a candidate came out of the popular base of the party, they were regarded by the establishment as so extreme and disastrous that they had to be eliminated. Michelle Bachmann, Herman Cain, Rick Santorum, one after another. And in the preceding primaries, the establishment, which controls the basic funding, the institutions, personnel, and so on, they were able to suppress in one way or another the candidates who arose from the base and to finally get their own man, like Romney in the last election, unpopular as he was among the base. This time, to everyone's surprise, they were unable to do it. Trump was the candidate of the popular base, and he simply overwhelmed the establishment candidates. And they're now in utter disarray, not even able to decide whether to support him, to hold their noses, as some say, and vote for him, or just to abandon the party. And the Democratic Party is not in much better shape, if you want to know the truth. So the Sanders supporters, we may see this in November. The Sanders supporters, who many of them young, energized, mobilized, bitter about establishment politics, and they may just not depart from the party. It's the kind of situation that, as I mentioned, we're also seeing in Europe with the decline of the centrist parties.
Do you have a sense of what is going to happen here? Because just speaking yesterday to a commentator, we're trying to predict not only what those who voted in the primaries are going to do, those who might be seen, there might be registered voters, they might be seen as very motivated voters, but what anyone else who's going to turn out to the polls is going to do. Do you have a sense of it? What this outcome's going to be?
Well, I think we're going to see in the coming months up to the election a very ugly scene of bitterly harsh, negative advertising, denunciations, condemnations, hatred, fury. You can hope that out of these forces, like especially the Sanders forces, there might come an organized movement that would sustain, not be directed specifically to the electoral extravaganza, but would be a continuing force. Could happen, and it could even happen that they would be joined by the largely white working class supporters of Trump. That's conceivable. In fact, it's kind of striking to compare the present situation with that of the 1930s, which I am old enough to remember personally. the 1930s, the Depression, the circumstances were much more grim. It was a much poorer country. The conditions were far harsher. But subjectively, it was a much more optimistic period. People felt that we would get out of this somehow. There was the labor unions, which had been virtually destroyed in the 1920s, were reconstituting. There was militant labor action, the CIO organizing sit-down strikes, activism about race issues, and so on. A lot of pressure from the public. There were political organizations of many kinds. There was a lot of debate, discussion, activism on many fronts. There was a fairly sympathetic administration, and the effect of it was to yield the New Deal legislations, which they didn't end the Depression. The war ended the Depression, but they did soften the edges and give people a sense of hopefulness and expectation that the future will be better. That's strikingly lacking now, but it might consolidate. It's not impossible that that existing forces will organize themselves in a way that will yield a subjective experience and direct activism of a kind that could lead to policies that will overcome the harsh effect of the neoliberal programs. They're not graven in stone. They can be changed.
The odd thing about this is that the political response, it seems, has come ahead almost of the popular uprising. We have certainly seen activism, whether it's the 1% movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, we've seen activism. But what we're seeing in this bizarre election at this stage is that the political response of the overall citizenry appears to have come ahead of marching on the streets, which, last time we looked at real upheavals, the 1960s, if we look at this cycle, as you say, this pushback between the elites who like to control politics and finance and everybody else. If you look at the 60s, where there was very tumultuous, protests from various disenfranchised groups who reached out to a citizenry who said, yes, actually, you're right about this, the political response seemed to be coming ahead of that.
Well, the 60s were quite a different period. There were several critical issues. First, the Civil Rights Movement, which had in its early stage, through the early 60s, had a very definite goal that was quite intelligible and acceptable to a large mass of the population, such as giving voting rights to disenfranchised blacks. The Civil Rights Movement, beginning in about 1964-65, took a different turn. Martin Luther King did not end his activism with his I Have a Dream speech. He went on to try to develop a poor people's movement, a movement of whites and blacks that would overcome poverty and oppression on class lines. You may recall that he was assassinated when he was supporting a public worker strike and was about to lead a march on Washington to establish the Poor People's Movement. And at that point, he was beginning to confront class issues, which led to a pretty negative reaction among Northern liberals. That part of his life has been pretty much suppressed, though it was his central concern. But at that point, by the mid-60s, the energy and force of activism was largely mobilized by the anti-war movement at that time, which became a massive force by 68, 69. So that was the activism on the streets that one primarily saw. Today, if you count the number of people, especially young people, who are directly involved in one or another activist concern, I think it's higher than it was in the 60s. I can see that in the colleges, in community groups, and so on. it's diverse. It's in many different directions, and there's nothing yet that's organized and focused on fundamental change in the institutional structures of the society, as there was in the 1930s and to an extent in the 60s. But I think that could come. As I mentioned, if you take a look at the attitudes of the by now large majority of the population, including both Sanders and Trump supporters, they do have a kind of a New Deal social democratic character. And that could lead to a revival of the labor movement, exactly as happened in the 30s, militant actions, political organization, but pressure to reverse the harsh political legislative choices of the past generation, and to restore a healthy period of growth with relative equality, as in fact took place in the 1950s and 60s when the New Deal programs were still in force. For example, the financial institutions which you mentioned. In the 1950s and 60s, they were controlled and regulated. There were no financial crises. These began with Ronald Reagan, with deregulation, which actually began under late Carter, much more so under Reagan than beyond. Then you get periodic financial crises, crashes, booms and busts, stagnation, decline for many people. Real male wages, for example, are about at the level of the late 60s. There's been plenty of growth and plenty of increase in wealth, but it's gone into very few hands, remarkably few, very similar to the 1920s, in fact. But that can change, just as it changed in the 30s.
In fact, this is what the documentary puts into stark relief, really. It shows how much of the tax burden, the overall tax burden of the country, has been shifted down from the highest earners to the middle and the lower classes, and it's quite stark. And also, as you said, the booms and busts. You had this experience in the 1990s of an expanded time of growth in the United States in the sense that this would carry on. But if there's one thing that has also really shaken up and is feeding into the mood at the moment, it was the 2007-08 GFC, and particularly the bailout of the banks. And this is another interesting part of the documentary, again, that we know, but you just put so many layers of detail behind it, which is that the banks were once servants of business. They were there to oil the wheels of the productive sector, to lend and to be a safe store of money. But what has happened is what you call the financialisation of the economy, and I think it's something like 40% of the US economy is now banking, including speculative banking and financial companies. And this, again, especially when those institutions were bailed out by the taxpayer, seems to have built a great anger that is bubbling beneath the surface.
Well, the anger is focused on the bailout, which was very prominent and visible. But there's a constant policy of bailout, which is less visible, but is quite significant. For example, there happened to be an IMF study a couple of years ago of the profits of the half a dozen major American banks. And it turns out that their profits relied almost entirely on an implicit government insurance policy, what's known informally as too big to fail. There's a recognition that the government is going to bail them out if they're in trouble. That gives them access to cheap credit, higher inflated credit ratings, incentives to undertake risky, hence in the short term profitable transactions, which may collapse, but it's not their problem. The taxpayer will step in. The total yearly funding from the taxpayer to the banks was estimated by the business press, Bloomberg Business Week, at about $80 billion a year, which is essentially the profits of the banks. Now, that's not directly visible the way the bailouts were, the AIG bailout and others. But it's an indication of the parasitic character and often predatory character of the financial institutions, which have shifted substantially from their role as increasing the productive capacity of the economy, as you said, to speculation, highly complex financial instruments which distribute risk and are allegedly, but in fact quickly are unregulated, a kind of a shadow banking economy which is fundamentally unregulated. And the costs of it ultimately fall on the taxpayer, not only by the regular crises that have taken place since the Reagan years, but also by the constant subsidy, the hidden implicit subsidy from the tacit insurance policy that the government provides.
Two observations. I think the ratings agencies actually factor in that in another bust there would be a taxpayer bailout again, which is quite extraordinary. And second observation, you argue this is an abuse of capitalism, that if this were capitalism operating, people would face the direct consequences of their poor investments. It is, in fact, a far more socialistic safety net for a portion of the community.
Actually, it should be understood that we are very far from a capitalist economy. I mean, take the technology that you use, computers, internet, iPhones, all of this stuff. And where does that come from? Well, if you look at it, it comes very substantially from taxpayer-funded research and development at university laboratories, for example, such as the laboratory where I've worked for 60 years at MIT, often for decades, in fact. The computers and the internet were developed, the core of the modern high-tech economy were developed for decades, substantially at public expense, either public institutions or subsidies to corporations, or even devices like procurement, which are a kind of a subsidy to corporations. For example, when IBM in the 1950s was able to shift from punch cards to contemporary computers, largely because of what was being done in the government-supported laboratories, or by direct funding. And finally, in the early 60s, they were able to produce on their own the world's fastest computer, but nobody could buy it. It was far too expensive. So the government bought them for Los Alamos, the nuclear weapons development programs. And in fact, even something like procurement is a substantial taxpayer subsidy to the corporate system. Well, if you look at what happened, same with the Internet was in the public sector for several decades before it was privatized under Clinton. What happens is that the public is essentially paying the costs. Profit-making and marketing are handed over to the private sector, but the taxpayer who pays the costs is not getting paid back. In a capitalist system, if you make a risky investment, or even any investment, and ultimately it turns out to be profit-making, you're supposed to get some of the profit. That's not the way it works here. This is a system, and it's the same throughout the industrial societies. It's a system of public subsidy, private gain to a substantial extent, quite remote from capitalism.
It's also in stark relief at the moment again, isn't it, when you look at the likes of Facebook and Google and how much spotlight there is now on the paltry tax they pay relative to the massive profits they make, precisely the sort of stuff that's coming out of the Panama Papers at the moment, and again feeding into this sense of frustration. As you say, that not only is there an unequal divide between the very wealthy and those who aren't, which is tolerated to a point, isn't it? But that it is getting extreme in a way that, as you say, is corrosive to democracy. Is it corrosive to democracy, or is what we're seeing at the moment democracy beginning to act?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that it's tolerated. It's accepted, but not tolerated. And accepted because people don't know what to do about it. The anger and fear and hatred that you see is an indication of how it's not tolerated, just accepted. As far as democracy is concerned, as inequality grows sharply, democracy almost automatically declines. In fact, you can see this very clearly in the careful studies that are done right in mainstream academic political science of relations between attitudes and policies. It's a pretty straightforward inquiry. The policies we see, the attitudes of people we know pretty well from extensive and pretty reliable and sophisticated polling, so you can compare them. And the results are quite striking. For example, there was Princeton University a year or so ago published a study by two leading political scientists, Martin Gilens, Benjamin Page, in which they investigated, I think it was maybe 1,500 or so major political decisions, and compared them with public attitudes. And it turned out that they were uncorrelated with what the public wanted, in fact, contrary to what the public wanted, but conformed very closely to what narrow elites of private concentrations of wealth wanted. And the reasons for that are another study by Martin Gillen's book called Affluence and Influence investigated the attitudes of considered the population across income wealth in the income wealth spectrum, and found that for about the lower 70%, they were effectively disenfranchised in that their own representatives paid essentially no attention to what their attitudes and wishes were. As you move up the spectrum, you get a little more influence. At the very top, policies are essentially made. Actually, campaign funding, which is now a big issue and is a significant factor, is a little bit misunderstood. The campaign funders do not only try to effectively buy the candidates, but they also buy access, which is quite critical. If you are a big funder to some congressman, let's say, you can gain access to that congressman's office and staff, which means that your lobbyists and corporate lawyers will be pretty soon effectively writing the legislation which the congressperson then signs. That happens to a very substantial extent. So these the inequality, the concentration of wealth, the political power that goes along with it, which leads to legislation that carries the cycle forward, it creates a kind of self-supporting cycle leading in the same direction of undermining of democracy. Parallel in Europe, through slightly different mechanisms, is the shift of decision-making away from the public and national parliaments to the bureaucracy in Brussels with the French and German banks looking over their shoulders. That's part of the reason for the extreme disillusionment and anger about collapse of democratic processes in Europe. These kinds of things are happening all over the world, and they are a pretty direct consequence of the neoliberal policies that were initiated pretty much from the 1980s.
What does it look like now, though? The American dream that you refer to, you spoke especially of the 50s and 60s, and it's essentially a contract, isn't it, where someone, works hard, can buy the car, can buy the house, can get their kids educated, can hope for their kids to have a better future than they did. That's sort of the snapshot of the American dream. It was like a deal. It was like a contract, right? But now we are in the 21st century, and it is a globalised world, and the forces of technology are what they are. Our mobility and our desire to travel is what it is as well. And also we are staring down the face as we keep reading of, I think the latest report I saw was 50% of white-collar jobs, as they stand now, will not be here, and certainly not in the form they are now, in just 10 or 20 years. So if there is to be a rebalancing in all the ways we've just been discussing, what would it look like in the 21st century?
That's pretty much up to us. There's nothing inherent in the technology or even in globalization that leads to these outcomes. It's a result of very specific policies that are designed to have these outcomes. So, for example, take the contemporary information technology. It can be used for various purposes. It can be used to increase the concentration of power, surveillance, domination, control, or it can be used to empower people. So let's be quite concrete. A couple of years ago, the Obama administration effectively nationalized the U.S. auto industry. That's the bailout of the auto industry. It was effectively nationalized. There were several choices that were possible then. One choice, the one that was taken, was to restore the industry to its former owners or clones of the former owners, essentially the same ownership management class, and to direct the industry to producing just what it had before, cars and trucks. There was another possibility. The industry could have been handed over to what are called stakeholders, the workforce and the community, to run it themselves, using advanced information technology and other technology to facilitate and expedite this development. And it could have been directed to producing not cars and trucks primarily, but what the country desperately needs, high-speed mass transportation. The United States is very backward by world standards in this respect. I happen to live in Boston. The Boston to New York corridor is one of the most traveled in the world. The prize of the train system is the Acela Express, which goes from Boston to New York. Actually, it's about 15 minutes faster than when I took it in 1950. In any European country and most other countries, it would take half the time that it takes here, and that's all over the country. Infrastructure is collapsing. There's underfunding of schools, of teachers. Everywhere you look, there's a massive work to be done. There's idle hands who want to do it. There's plenty of resources. The system is not designed to put them together. Now take this threat that you mentioned, that technology will eliminate jobs. That can be harmful, or it could be a great thing. It would mean that boring, routine jobs would be would be handed over from people to machines, to robots, and people would be freed to undertake creative activity that would be beneficial to themselves and contribute to the community. The technology doesn't care. You can use it either way, and that's true across the board. The same is true of what's called globalization. Just consider the trade agreements that are now being negotiated, the Pacific and Atlantic trade agreements. They could be designed for the benefit of people. They're not. They're designed for the benefit of investors. These are investor rights agreements. They're not trade agreements except very marginally. That's clear in many respects. That's one of the reasons they're kept secret. They're, of course, not totally secret. They're not secret from the corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing the details, but they're effectively secret from the population. And when something appears, as it did a couple of days ago, when Greenpeace released a couple hundred pages of documents of the Atlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, so-called trade agreement, it just scandalized the populations when they saw what's being planned behind their backs, and mostly in secret. In the United States and comparably elsewhere, the effort is to negotiate these things in secret, not, of course, in secret from private power, and then to ram it through Congress in a Stalinist-style technique, what's called fast track. No discussion, no debate, just vote yes or no, which means vote yes. That's the way the earlier agreements were rammed through, and that's what they're hoping for this one. But that's not a property of globalization as such. That's a property of a particular form of globalization designed in the interests of the designers.
Thank you, Noam Chomsky. Thank you so much. The book is, sorry, not the book, the film is Requiem for the American Dream. It's here at the Documentary Edge International Festival. Details on our webpage, May 24th and Saturday, May 28th. It is screened